Welcome to Bounce, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of product teams, the challenges they face, and the incredible stories of resilience that emerge. I'm Mollie Cox, your co-host, a product designer with a knack for navigating through the storms of creativity.
And I'm your co-host, Claire Flowers, a product manager who's seen it all, the highs, the lows, and everything in between.
Each week, we'll bring you tales of product traumas, those moments that test our limits, they push our boundaries, and sometimes bring us to our knees.
We're talking about career flops and follies and those pivotal moments when everything seems to fall apart.
But as we know, the harder you fall, the higher you bounce. We'll explore with our guests their toughest challenges,
The actions they took to overcome them,
and how these experiences have shaped their careers and continue to impact them today.
So join us in this journey of resilience, growth, and bouncing back stronger than ever.
Welcome to Bounce. I am Mollie Cox, your co-host, with Claire Flowers, who is also co-host. Today, we're really excited. We're joined by Sarah Wachter-Boettcher, who is a leadership coach, a speaker, and an author. Also, the CEO of Active Voice, a company dedicated to creating bold leaders and better workplaces in design and tech. She actually started Active Voice in 2020 after spending a decade running a content and UX consultancy. As that author, her books include Technically Wrong, Designed for Real Life, and Content Everywhere. Super excited to welcome you on the show, Sarah. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. Always love content design. If you've listened to previous episodes, huge advocate. So I'm really excited to jump into this one. I myself have had the opportunity to take several workshops from Active Voice in the past. So really excited to have you here. Hope a lot of other people get welcomed into Active Voice and discover what you guys are and who you're about. So first, Sarah, I would love to kind of understand a little bit about your journey. I know in the past you were a consultant and now you've gone into leadership. Talk a little bit how you went into consultancy and then what that transition looked like for you.
Yeah, so I started out my career, I guess, very temporarily working at an advertising agency as a copywriter. And from there, moved into a role where I was a web writer. And this was in about 2007, maybe I started there. And very quickly, it became clear that there was a lot of work to be done when it came to the content we were working with for our clients. And so I really got into content strategy, which at the time was basically if you touched content on any digital experience, you got labeled content strategist. So there was a lot of work that I would now call maybe content design, UX writing. There was work that was very much information architecture. There was a lot of understanding of existing content assets and building systems for them, but also things like collaborating with designers on how the experience was going to flow and what was the right flow for a login experience or whatever it was, right? And so I worked there for several years and ended up building up a team, and it was a smallish agency, so I ended up as a director, kind of reporting into the owners. And from there, I was interested in really kind of deepening that content and UX work in a way that wasn't necessarily what that agency was focused on. And I was living in Arizona at the time. My partner was in graduate school, and when he was finishing, we were looking at moving somewhere, and we weren't sure where. We were going to kind of follow along some stuff that was happening in his career, and so I was like, okay, I need to have a plan for myself. So I quit my job and I started consulting, and figured this would help me become more like location independent. I could pursue more of the kinds of work I wanted to do. And also I didn't really have a better plan. So I did that. And it was really good for me. I did that for about a decade, and I worked on a lot of very interesting projects. Started touching more product work somewhere in there as that kind of really emerged as a field. And I also started writing and speaking a lot. So that's when the publishing began. I wrote Content Everywhere and Designed for Real Life in there, and then eventually Technically Wrong. And, after doing that for a bunch of years, I think one of the things that became very clear to me when I would go in and I would work with organizations, or maybe I would come in and I'd be like running a workshop with the kind of inclusive and ethical design stuff that came out of my books. And people would come up to me and they would say, like, I really want to change how things are done here, but I don't feel like I can speak up. I don't feel like I have power. I don't feel like I have a voice. And that got me really interested in, more of the workplace dynamics and team dynamics and communication and relationships and power at work. And so that sort of sent me down this path of really looking at, what I will loosely call leadership, but I think that also is like can be a frame that doesn't work for everybody if you really associate that with like the senior echelons in a company, as opposed to more like taking ownership of how you're working and why you're doing it that way. Anyway, along the way that turned into Active Voice, and that was really about how do we help people have a better relationship with their work? How do we help people show up more boldly in their work, but also like attach less of their identity to their work? Because I think that for so many people working, particularly in like design and UX, I see it maybe most of all, there's so much like personal attachment oftentimes to the work because there is something you really care about in there. And that can so easily be exploited in an organization that doesn't necessarily care about users, but does care about growth. And I think one of the things I have found is that there's a lot of people who are really struggling to make sense of putting some boundaries around their career while also standing up for the things they really believe in. It's like, it feels like you have to be in or out. It's like either work is my whole life and my whole identity, or you have to kind of take a step back and be like, I don't care about anything. It's all BS, whatever. And I really want to help people find like a third way in there. And that's a lot of what we do.
That's interesting. Kind of, well, boundaries, but this idea of figuring out, are you all in or are you just kind of there for the ride? It feels so black and white so often. I mean, even to the point, I don't know about you, Claire, or you, Sarah, but when people ask me, what's your hobby? I'm like, work.
Uh-huh. Oh,
Yeah.
Molly. I mean, this is something I've talked with a lot of people about, and it's come up a lot where I've asked, like, well, like who, not just what do you do outside of work, but like, who are you beyond your job? And for a lot of people, the answer feels very unclear because they've wrapped so much identity up in the job. And I think one of the things that we really try to help people figure out for themselves is not like, it's not just about like work-life balance or separating work from life or saying that like work doesn't matter and it's, like none of your identity can be attached to your work. But it's more like flipping some priorities around and saying like, who am I and what do I care about at the highest level, regardless of what spaces I'm in? Whether I'm in my personal life or my work life, whether I'm in this job or that job, whatever it is that I'm doing, like, who am I and what are some of the values that are most important to me? What makes me feel like I'm operating from a place of integrity with myself? And then being able to say, what are the ways in which my work can support that aspect of my identity? It isn't the identity itself, but how can my work support that? And then also, where can it not? Like, where is that asking too much of a job? And where can I kind of put work in its place and say, work can help affirm parts of me, but it cannot be like the driver. Because when it's the driver, it's like if work's not going well, then life isn't going well. If you lose your job, like so many people have the last couple of years, then you lose your identity with your job. It sort of like puts way too much of emphasis on work. But I do think that we need to think about the relationship between our work and our identity and to give ourselves permission to care about our work, because I actually don't think that there's this other sort of cynical take that's like, you just shouldn't care about it. It's just capitalism. It's just BS. It's just a paycheck. And I don't think that actually is working very well for people either. I feel like those people are also quite miserable. And I really think it's much more about like, we need a more nuanced perspective on it.
Yeah, I think I was having this conversation with a colleague not too long ago just about, I don't know, and I don't want to bring Gen Z into it, but I've managed a lot of Gen Z designers, and there's something so refreshing about their mentality. It's like so many Gen Z, and I'm not going to encapsulate everybody into one big bucket, but so many have this identity of themselves and put work so secondary. And in my head, I'm like, oh man, like what would that even be like? I have all the agency trauma in my life from behind me, and I bring that trauma now, and I have this work because you're nobody unless you work, and this is where you go to. So I just personally think it's so refreshing to see that changing as we evolve,
And it's like, one of the things I often see is when there is some sort of generational difference. And I don't want to like overplay the generational divide
Right,
between like,
exactly.
Gen Z and millennial, whatever, because I think that can get very like us versus them in a way that I don't
And
think
it's
helps anybody.
problematic, yeah.
But there are generational differences or trends that we can look at. And I think one impulse that people have when a newer generation comes up, and their mentality or mindset sort of challenges an existing one, is to get very defensive and to kind of be like, those people don't want to work, or they don't get it, or they don't know what I went through, or to do the thing that's like, I went through a whole bunch of hell to get to where I am, so I'm going to make sure you go through that kind of hell too. And I think about that, and I think like, what a small way to live, you know? And so I'm glad, Molly, you look at it with like that more, oh, this is interesting. And like, oh, maybe I want some of this, right? Like sometimes I think it's like we feel a little jealous of that perspective if we have a hard time getting to that place ourselves. And that jealousy turns into wanting to like crush it in the other party, as opposed to, oh, what if that's like, I'm craving that. What if I got curious about that? And what if I got curious about what makes it hard for me to actually operate in that way? Which I think is a much healthier way to deal with those generational divides that you notice.
Yeah.
I definitely relate to this so much because I don't know if other people can have experienced the same, but for a long time in my career, there were certain things that really worked and got me far. As a female, it was, you know, being accommodating, being very collaborative, being able to really work very collaboratively, cross functionally, and it got to a point where those things really started to not serve me very well, and because I was kind of just like moving forward with how I was naturally, and that worked. And then I got to a point in my career where it was like, that doesn't work anymore. So I had I read a book that's called The Myth of the Nice Girl, like achieving a career that you love without becoming someone that you hate. And it was very illuminating because it forced me to kind of like unpack those behaviors that I like associated with myself and figure out how to reposition them and make them work in the workplace without having to like compromise. But it's such a process. Like I still kind of struggle with it today. So I say all that to say I'm curious to know, working with so many different people, do you find that this happens with folks early in their careers, or really it can happen at any moment during their career?
I think you've really hit on something that's a common thread for people. And I would say it's also not exclusive to women, but there's definitely a gendered component to it, that women and anybody, if you were socialized female, sort of regardless of how you identify now, you probably got a lot of messaging kind of baked in early on about being nice, being helpful, being accommodating, being easy to work with or pleasant, right? And like, what I have found is that for a lot of people, that shows up so from a gendered lens, and it also shows up based on role. So if you're in a role that tends to be considered like an underdog in your organization, then that's also something you're often taught to do. You hear it like with content people, you hear it with researchers, who are often like underdogs within a design organization, but then you also hear it from design as a whole, because it's often the underdog within a broader like product org or something like that. And anytime there's an org that is considered more that underdog function, where it gets positioned as kind of like a nice to have, and part of your job is like trying to convince more people to actually engage you and work with you and invite you to the meetings sooner, there can be a lot of that pressure to be people pleasy, to kind of like always show up, always be helpful, always jump in at the last minute. And you can also get that messaging in a career early on, that's telling you that that's how you're going to get ahead. And it's not that there's no truth to that. There is some truth to it, particularly whether it's for your kind of practice area or for you as an individual. I think there is truth to it in the sense that early on, you can have some like wins that way, because by being helpful, showing up, being like not complaining, but jumping in at the last minute, even though they should have invited you 3 months ago, but they didn't, but you're still there with a smile on because you're fixing it on the way out the door, right? Being that person, it does get people to kind of go, like I like having Claire around. Things are better when Claire's around. And then maybe we should invite Claire to more stuff. But there's a real cap on it though, because the way that people are valuing your work is in a very kind of small way. that you get valued for being able to jump in and firefight, right? And like fix problems at the last minute. You get valued for kind of your like your stick to itness, right? Like putting in the hours, or you're valued, like you're valued as a workhorse, you're valued as a helper. But you're not necessarily valued in the way that you would want to be valued, particularly when it starts going into like, what does it mean for your career path? Or what does it mean for sort of like the development and maturity of your part of the organization? It's like, you're valued because you make life easier for other people, not because of the unique and special things that you truly bring. And people don't really see you fully. What they see is the little bit that has been helpful to them. And I think it can be difficult, but it's really important to kind of break out of that cycle of always like pleasing and appeasing others, and to really say, what is special about what I bring that only I can offer? What is actually the most meaningful work that I could be doing? And how do I spend more time and energy with the people and in the spaces where I feel like that is heard and seen and respected? How do I give less to the people who just want me to fill a gap and don't actually see my true value? And also, how do I maybe set some boundaries and assert myself in a way where some people might like me a little bit less, and it's in service of doing the work that is most important, and it's being valued at a higher level, even if you're liked personally a little less. And that's sometimes really hard for people to do.
Yeah, I think that right there was the thing that would just kind of blew my mind, was that what I kind of like really defaulted on was like fixing this problem, keeping things on track, being a helper, moving things forward. And then I got into a role where that was not really where the value was shown. The more you did that, the less influence you really had. And so I mean, I'm still have to go through it like today. It's really psychologically strange.
Yeah. And
no, especially I think there's something, women in tech, women in product teams, especially, I know, Claire, you're a product manager, but as a designer too, it's almost like this double whammy. Like, we're designers and we constantly have to sell our value, and we have to sell why we do the things we do, why we're needed on the team, just as you were talking about, Sarah. But then we have that extra added layer of being female, right? And so I'm trying to prove value in two different slots. And that's what starts to feel extremely overwhelming to me.
Well, and then to loop it back to what we talked about before around identity, it's also like, if your identity is totally wrapped up in your job, then it's really important to be liked and wanted at a personal level. Because if you're not, then your sense of identity fractures. When you wrap less of your identity up in your work, it's a lot easier to say, it is important to me to do a good job, and it's important to me to do the kind of work I believe really matters. And it is important to me to assert myself in the ways I believe matter. And that is more important than being liked, because I don't have to be likable all the time to be validated as a human being. And I think that's one of the big shifts with identity, is that the connection between our identity and our jobs, when that is so bound up together, you can't let go of that desire to be liked and wanted, because it is really destabilizing to you as a human. So I think like starting with really like understanding who you are as a human being, not just outside of work, but sort of like at a higher order than work, right? Like at a higher plane of existence than work, is a foundation for then having an easier time, as you said, Claire, psychologically with all of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It just felt so, I started hearing it, and it was really when I moved into the role of like true product manager, I started hearing things like, you should be more confident, when I had never gotten that feedback before. And I always felt very confident, but it was like, I had to just reevaluate my style. And honestly, what I started doing was I started just observing the men in the room and how they acted. And so this was kind of early when I was trying to unpack everything. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll just act like them. So when I did, it still didn't work.
Uh-huh.
it still didn't work.
Classic.
It didn't work. Let me provide like a specific example.
Yeah.
So I grew up, my dad he leads a construction company, and like growing up, there were a few key values my parents always preached. Humility was one of them. So I'd watch him in a room and he'd say, well, I'm not the expert, but I think that X, Y, and Z. And I'd watch everybody just go, that Bob, he is so humble. He has so much humility. What a great
standing ovation.
What a great man. And so like naturally, he's my dad. I grew up with him. I kind of like started mirroring some of those patterns. But the difference in being a woman is when you say things like, well, I'm not the expert, they believe you. They don't take it as humility. If you say you're not the expert, they say she's not the expert. But I would watch my, male counterparts express humility in this way. And it was like, oh, what a charming man. But when I did it, they believed me. And so it's been this just a very strange thing to learn. And I'm still working on it today.
Yeah. And I think the reason you're still working on it is that there is no perfect answer to this. I hear about it all the time where it's a double standard, right? Which means that you get in these binds where, you're a pushover, you're too soft, you need to be more assertive. Not like that. Now you're aggressive. Now you're bossy. You're a bitch.
Just walk that line. Just got a little too close.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. Yep. Yeah. And it's like thread the needle, but the needle's not threadable. And so it's like, there's this mentality that you hear kind of like coming at you from all corners. That's sort of like, oh no, you can definitely succeed if you're just a little more like this, but also not like this, but not like this, like this. And like you get this narrower and narrower thing that you're trying to do to somehow be perfect. And that there's this idea that if you were just perfect, then you wouldn't have these problems. When the answer is like, no, actually, like men show up a lot of different ways and they don't have these problems. What do you want to do with that? And I think what my perspective on this is like, this is a systems problem that you as an individual cannot fix. Like there is no way that you can show up that will perfectly thread that needle and prevent these problems from happening, because they are not actually about the way that you're showing up. They are about a societal level bias against women and people who are perceived female that is so much deeper, like exists at such a deep level that a lot of people don't even realize they're doing it. And if you are subject to that bias, you have some choices to make for yourself, because you can't get rid of it, right? Like you are not able to solve that problem because it is not a you problem. And you have to be able to look at it and say, okay, if I can accept that that's a systems problem, then I have my choices are limited to how do I want to respond to that system? And what I have found is that trying to thread the needle doesn't work very well, because it's exhausting and you will still get the same, like you still get the feedback that you're somehow doing it wrong. Giving up is depressing, because then you're just going to accept it as it is and end up feeling really browbeaten and cynical. And that's a recipe for burnout. It's not just that you stop putting pressure on your career. It's also like when you really just like give up and shut down, there is a cost emotionally to kind of living in that kind of closed off way. I think that the best answer, which is by no means a perfect answer, but the best answer tends to come when people say, I accept that I cannot win this game. And so instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop trying to win it and instead say, what feels like a confident expression of myself? What are some actual like aspects of my true self that I can bring out? Not bring your whole self to work, because like your work is probably not a safe place to bring your whole self, but to say, can I allow some parts of myself to shine through? Can I bring some realness? Can I bring some actual like connection to people? Because if you're trying to fake it all the time and like be this assertive person in this certain way that they think is how you're supposed to be, and then you're going to be told you were bossy anyway, like you're going to come off in a way that doesn't feel good. It's not going to be your strongest, and it's not even going to work. And instead to kind of say, can I really home in on who I am when I'm at my best and try to bring that energy? And to say, it is not going to connect with everybody. Part of that is just human. And part of that is that people are biased. And so some people are going to have a reaction no matter what I do. But if I do that, that is my best chance of connecting with my people. That is my best chance of being heard by the people I really care about. And to trust that, like, that's also my best chance of staying connected to myself, of like continuing to feel like I'm operating in a way that feels okay for me. And I think that is the path that I tend to recommend for people, is to try to figure out what that looks like and then modulate it, right? Like, you may be in some environments where you hold back more because it's an environment that's particularly risky for you, and figuring out what your risk looks like in a different environment, right? Like, if you are in a really senior role and the job market is particularly good and blah, 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 you might decide, you know what? I am not going to hold back a whole lot right now. If you're new to a less senior role and you just made a career pivot in a terrible job market, you may decide, I'm going to hold back a little bit more. But those things end up being more like, those are choices to modulate how much of myself I kind of bring to this based off of the risk profile in the moment, as opposed to, I need to change who I am and how I am because how I am is wrong and not good enough. It's like, that's the shift that happens, is no longer internalizing some of that stuff.
I love that. It's like figuring out the right amount of you for the situation rather than changing who you are inherently for those people in the situation, right?
Yeah. And it's also saying, you know what? There's always risk, right? Like, whenever you are open and real, there's a level of vulnerability, and vulnerability is the same as risk. And that you're open to somebody criticizing you. You're open to potentially having backlash. It doesn't mean that risk is bad. What it means is, like, risk is something that we assess, and like, some risks are very worth it and some are not worth it. And so it's being able to say there's always going to be risk, and there's also risk to shutting down and playing small. There's risk to, like, cutting off that part of myself, because that risk is feeling like disconnected from myself and feeling miserable. Like, that's worth something too. And so I think looking at it and saying, like, which risks feel like the right mix for me in this moment, and checking in with yourself often, that those things are going to change in different circumstances and at different points in your life.
Yeah, I think there's something to what I'm hearing emerge in my head anyway is psychological safety, right? I feel like we have these layers within an organization. Product teams, you've got the design team, the product management team, ops, what have you within the organization. And then you've got the stakeholders above that and whatever level of executive leadership or anything along those lines. I think as a leader, you mentioned vulnerability, you mentioned words like that. I think it is so crucial for my own team to feel that way within the team that we have created, so they can have that vulnerability and be coached to walk into a room with stakeholders and understand how to bring that very specific part of themselves there. So what for you, Sarah, what strategies do you use often to foster psychological safety and that trust within teams that you're working with?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is, Mollie, you mentioned it being teams that you're leading. Well, yeah, because it starts with you, right? Like, so when you're in a role where you're leading others, I think the biggest thing is to remember that you are modeling what is acceptable and what is safe in that environment. And if you allow yourself to be vulnerable with your team and I don't mean like oversharing or telling them all of your personal business, but like being able to talk about things that are hard for you, being able to talk about some of the challenges you faced in your career, like those things can really help create space where people feel like that's okay, and that it's okay to have these conversations. And as part of that, I also think that there's almost a flip side in teams where you have a manager who's really trying to create safety, where the manager will also like be very protective of the team, meaning like the kind of classic, like I'm going to be the kind of like the shield, the shit umbrella, right? Like that's the common term. Like, I'm going to protect my team from everything. And I'm also going to be the buffer. I'm going to buffer anything that's happening above. I'm going to handle all the hard situations because I want to protect my people. I think the desire to protect your people is a good one, but I think that managers also really need to be mindful of not overprotecting their people from the reality of the organization. And by that, I mean, I think it's really healthy to coach your team on what are some of the things that they might face that are going to be hard for them, and where might things be unfair, and what are some of the things that you specifically as a leader, like somebody who has more structural power than them, some of the things you can do for them, but also what are some of the things that you can't protect them from because they're too much for you to take on. Like, I also think like managers who try to protect their teams from everything, their teams tend not to grow, but also the manager tends to burn out because they end up in a martyr role. So really being able to say, my job isn't to protect them from all of the things that are going to go wrong or all of the potential problems or all the difficult people. My job is to clear some paths when my power, my relative power in the organization, makes that path appropriate for me to clear for them. And then to coach them on how they can show up and work through some of that stuff. And also, again, not internalize some of the BS. So if they go into a room and they bring some of them, their real self into that situation, and they show up powerfully and they're not heard, what support do they have to remember that maybe that's not them? Maybe that's about biases that are in the room. Maybe that's about like organizational priorities that are simply misaligned with design or whatever it is that they come from. And to be able to navigate that stuff in a way that helps them build resilience to the like ebbs and flows of an organization, and also retain a strong sense of self and the ability for them to still feel good about the work that they're doing, even if it doesn't always work out the way that they want. I think that is a much healthier way to think about how you can help that team. But it all starts with, like, you can't do that for them if you don't have strong relationships with those team members. And you won't build a strong relationship with those team members unless there's a sense of trust. And that trust comes from like a sense of mutuality, that they're being listened to, and that you are somebody who also struggles, is human, has feelings, and that you are open about some of the things that are hard for you. Like, when you're doing all of those things, you build the relationship in which they're then more open to that kind of coaching, and you can have those more nuanced conversations. And I think that that's kind of like the only real sustainable path for people management, because I mean, I've met a lot of people managers who have been like, I need to go back to IC work because I am so fried. And I mean, there's a bunch of reasons for that, but a huge one is that they're being very protective of their team at their own personal expense. And I just don't think that that's a manager's job. Like, I don't think it can be, to protect your team from an organization. Like, if that's what you have to do, then you have an organizational problem, and that's not your weakness as a manager.
So we've kind of talked about psychological safety. We've also talked about just being able to set boundaries. What common theme? I mean, you coach so many individuals and you lead workshops coaching. What common themes do you see emerge right now outside of those that you feel people in tech or designers or product managers are facing on that very regular basis? What are those themes you hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've touched on a lot of them already, right? Like that real over identification with the job, the lack of boundaries, lack of kind of keeping perspective on it. Also just the kind of pressure people are under in organizations, especially with layoffs or the threat of layoffs sort of looming around them, and this sort of message of, we need you to do more with less. We're tightening things down. There's a lot of pressure on people to do more faster. And I think for a lot of people who are in any kind of like human-centered discipline, there's often a real tension between the values that they hold and some of the reasons they got into the work. So anybody with a UXy background, anybody with a designy background, right? Like where they are oftentimes got into the work because they wanted to make something that was helpful, useful, accessible, needed, and sometimes also, yes, like beautiful, creative, fun. Yeah, but often like in a way that like connects with humans. And then to be told that your whole job is about maximizing some metric or maximizing, revenue for shareholders, can be a real jarring experience for people. And I think that I think there's a lot in there. And I think some of it is like, you do have to make some level of peace with like, what is the business model of your business? And is it one that you can live with? And really, what is the business model? And really being able to say, okay, I accept that there are aspects of things that I really care about that maybe got me into this field that are simply not priorities in this company. And maybe there was more space for them when there wasn't an emphasis on tightening up headcount and tightening up budgets. But while there is not going to be a lot of space for that. And like, can I accept that? And then what does it mean for me to still do this work? Like, how do I still make this work feel okay if that's the case? And I think what ends up happening for a lot of people, because that is hard. And I don't want to pretend that it's like, it's hard and it doesn't feel good. Like there's grief there, because it's like, there's the grief of like letting go of this thing that you thought like really mattered. And you're like, oh, but nobody cares. But I think the alternative that I see a lot of people do is like, they're told, right? Like, oh, you're a designer. You need to learn business. You need to be more metrics oriented, data oriented. We need to focus on growth, blah, 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 blah. And everything gets very focused in this one direction. And then internally in the design community or in their team, it's like all these conversations that happen around like, have we looked at like having a more explicit like anti-racist lens on our content design principles, and what are we doing around inclusion in this part of the design system, and all of these questions that are like, yes. And so that tension, when that just exists like this, and it's just like running into each other, you're just hitting it over and over again, those tensions, and you haven't really faced that, I think it can feel very whiplashy, because you're kind of like telling yourself this one thing that is the stuff you care about, and in reality, your organization is prioritizing something else entirely. And that dissonance can cause, I think, a lot of strain, and can really, over time, I think, very much exhaust people. And that's when people hit that very like cynical level of burnout. I think that there is no perfect answer to that, but I think that kind of working out, like, how do I get honest with myself about what's going on? How do I make peace with what is and isn't possible in this job? How do I decide if maybe I can't make peace with it and need to make a change? And like all of that is a very different kind of conversation than sort of like out of the one side of your mouth being like, yeah, I guess I'll like learn to talk about business all the time. And the other side, I'm still trying to do all of my UX stuff that I really care about. Because I think that's where a lot of people are right now. And I think that is part of the reason you see so much, I think, just like exhaustion and overwhelm and some real like panicked doom and gloom prognostication happening.
I was just going to say overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, it's just overwhelming. Like even in the last week, I don't know what it is. I've seen numerous posts from designers about, well, is product design art or is it science? And it's like, well, what side did you come in on it? Like it can be a little bit of something for everything, but it just gets really overwhelming to think, okay, I guess it's not art. And I thought it was art. Now I have to think of it as a science. And that's just not the way my brain works. Am I in the right field? And then everything blows up and I have a meltdown. Just gave you a personal meltdown right there. But so it's just there, and there's just so much conflicting information, but it's you obviously have worked with so many professionals. You have such a great perspective on what's happening and how people work with one another. What challenges have you maybe faced that have led you to some of these insights that you're helping other people with? I know for myself, I struggle with boundaries every single day. I'm a yes person. I'm a people pleaser. I know that about myself. I constantly say yes, and it gets me in trouble all the time. And it's something I always work on. Were there moments for you, Sarah, that were standouts where it was like, this, I need to carry this forward and be sure that I help somebody else through something like this?
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have? There's
4 hours. Just kidding.
So many. I mean, I think for all of the kinds of work that we do now, because we kind of operate in a few related but a little bit different areas, I can go back and be like, here's how I used to see this that I realized didn't work. So like, for example, I very much saw the practice I was building, the content practice, UX practice in an agency that didn't really have that before I was there. I saw that as being so important and necessary that I threw all of myself into it. And what that also meant is that I was invaluable. People were always coming to my desk. I was the go-to person for all kinds of stuff because people would be like, Sarah will figure this out. And that meant that I was needed. I was important. I started working from home way before anybody was working remotely. This was like, I don't know, 2010 or something. Started working from home every morning until like 11, because as soon as I showed up at the office, I couldn't get anything done anymore because it was a constant stream of other people's things. And I look back on that and I think it's not that I don't want to be helpful. Being helpful is a nice thing to do, but it's that I was helpful at sort of the expense of my own mental health and well-being because I was working so much on stuff that I wasn't even scoped to, right? Like, and the way an agency model works, our revenue lines were structured in a way which is like, I won't even get into because it was done in a way that made no sense. But where I was like, I wasn't getting credit for that. It was hours I was billing, but that wasn't like revenue that was coming to my part of the org. And so therefore it wasn't contributing to how profitable my part of the org was. And so therefore it wasn't contributing to whether we were going to get more headcount or how we were perceived. And so I was actually doing all of this extra stuff that I thought was going to be helpful for other people and was also going to be helpful for the discipline that was actually like hurtful for me. So that's one thing. And then I would say the other part is like, I really had to figure out some things about myself, my way of reacting to things, my way of handling stress, my way of just like, I would say that my default behavior for most of my life was, I'll just handle it. And that got me a certain distance and then actually blew up on me many times. I think that feeling of like, well, somebody's got to step in. Somebody's got to get it done. Somebody's got to make it happen. Being like the one who's going to do the whole group project. The one who's default project managing the group project. And then when people don't do their part of the group project that you project manage, then you just end up doing it. Like I felt like that for a lot of my life. And I realized that, being overly responsible in that way is something I still struggle with, but being overly responsible in that way, it can also really prevent other people from stepping up, but it can also backfire on you when you can get overly blamed for things too. And I think I had to really look at, how was I communicating? Was I communicating? And also what was I getting from the people I was working with? And learning more about like, what does it look like to have a mutual working relationship, like where there is a sense of reciprocity, where we are having productive conversations and where we are having honest conversations. And then like, what do you do when you're not having those? And I think I learned that I had historically kind of just like kept on plowing forward. Like, oh, I'm not getting my needs met in this working relationship. And I'm not, instead of like taking a step back from it, I'm just going to like, just plow through it. Just keep on chugging forward. And then ending up deeper and deeper in working relationships that were not actually functional. And where they were only functional if I like handled everything, or only functional if I put up with whatever I was given, right? Like they were only functional if I basically like sublimated my own needs in the process. And I had to really be like, oh, that isn't good for you. And sometimes that also blows up, where it's like, because you actually reach the end of the line of your ability to do that. And I think hitting some of those ends of the line taught me a lot about the kinds of conversations I want to have around work, the kinds of relationships I want to have around work. And also like, what does it actually take to get there? What do I need to change about myself? And what do I need to bring to those conversations? But then also, very importantly, if I do that part, what do I need to get back in order to build and to not take those steps forward until I'm getting that back.
Have you found in those situations that you in inner relationships working with people that you tend to raise those concerns earlier as opposed to later, so that it doesn't like grow into this big thing that blows up? Is that something that's helpful?
Oh, I mean, yeah, I will tell you that um I had a working relationship where kind of shortly before starting Active Voice, where I was working with somebody I really cared a lot about, was close to personally and professionally, and um we were trying to make some stuff together, and I really felt like I wasn't clear on what they wanted from it or what they were trying to do. I was feeling like I know where I want this to go, but I feel like they're kind of just going along with me, but I can't figure out if that's because they're like super sold on my ideas or if they just feel like they need to go along with me. And I realized looking back, it was like I tried to raise that, but I didn't have the right skills. So when I tried to raise it, my impression, I mean, like I actually don't know what they think about it, but my impression is like, oh, I think I tried to raise it in a way that probably felt aggressive, because I was like, what do you think? What do you want? And then they would be like, they would just shut down. And I realized later, like, oh, right. Like they were going along with stuff as their coping mechanism for whatever was going on with them. They didn't know what to do. And then what they did ultimately is that they were like, yeah, go along, go along, go along. And then they pulled back and they just shut down entirely. And they were kind of like, never mind, and like left the whole thing. And what I realized out of that was like, I think we weren't having good conversations about our work together. I wanted to like, I think they probably wanted to too and didn't know how. I know I wanted to, and I tried to start those conversations, but I think because I can be loud and because I can be kind of like, I'm pretty quick to speak up when I have an idea. I think their interpretation might have been like that it felt aggressive or felt like like tell me right now, and which isn't what I intended. And I really had to learn, how to like create more space in those conversations. And also I had to learn that like I can't build like deep and important partnerships with somebody who's avoidant, who won't participate in a hard conversation, or who can't find a way to express, their needs, or when something isn't working for them. I mean, everybody has to work through their stuff, and this isn't to say like, I mean, avoidance is a really common pattern. Most humans do it some of the time. It's not to say that somebody has to be perfect by any means. I'm certainly very far from that. But it's like somebody who really they need to take it as like a responsibility they have to figure out how to talk about hard things. And, since then I've started working with Jen Dionisio. She started out freelancing a little bit with Active Voice and then joined full time in May of 2023 and is now much more of a business partner. I mean, we're still in the throes of like, there's like logistical, operational things we have to do. But it feels like we're very different. And she is naturally more of that peacemaker than I am. And she knows that like she cannot operate in that way and have productive working relationships. And I know that I need to create space for other ways of seeing in order to have productive working relationships. And we talk about this stuff all the time. And it means that our working relationship is totally different than anything I've had before. And I feel like all of that is possible because of the kind of work that I've been doing and she's been doing over the past several years, and the kind of work that we really try to help people do in our programs at Active Voice.
Yeah, I think so much about working with different personalities is being able to recognize like, okay, well, this person's an avoidant person. I know that maybe I should approach it this way, but that just comes with experience, like
Yeah.
I can working across so many different people. I can recognize like certain patterns with people, and I kind of know like how to be water a little bit. It doesn't always work, but you have to just kind of like take those notes and to move forward
Yeah.
for sure.
Well, and it's like you learning how to do that with others, but also like learning about yourself and saying, when I'm faced with this stuff, this is my tendency. What do I need to do to avoid relying on that tendency in the situations where that's actually not going to be useful, or that's going to actually be unfair? And it's both, right? It's like learning to adapt and work with others, but also learning to understand yourself and what are some of the things that might like activate you or trigger you in some way where you're going to be in a kind of a stress response, right? Which is where a lot of things like freaking out, shutting down, that's usually a reaction to stress. And you have to, so you learn that about yourself, you practice it, you make a commitment to stretch yourself in situations where you don't really want to, because it'd be easier to go back to the thing that you're used to. And you create more curiosity and spaciousness for the other party to kind of work with them with wherever they're coming from. And when both parties do that, it is amazing.
Yeah, I hear you laying out that expectation, right? Like when you're talking about you and Jen, it's like, this is what I need from a relationship and this is what I need. But you're being very clear and very forward with one another. I need to work on that. I know I tend to be a bottler upper. And so I expect people to read my mind. And if you're not reading my mind, then I get really frustrated. But that's my onus. Like if my mind isn't being read, I need to be the one forthcoming and set that expectation. Like I'm not getting what I need. And here's why I'm not getting what I need. Like we need to do this together. So
Molly, while we have Sarah here as moderator, do we need to talk about anything in our working relationship?
we need some relationship counseling, Sarah.
I mean, we all do, right? Yeah. I mean, actually, honestly, I think we all do. Like we all could really stand to think of our relationships as something that need to be worked on. Every relationship needs work to really function at its best and to be more than just a passing acquaintanceship. And not every relationship gets that work. And, and that's okay. Some relationships are going to stay kind of shallow, and that's fine. But I think that it's actually very healthy to say, if we want this to be a deeper partnership of any kind, like romantic, friendship, work, then we have to look at it as something that is like the relationship is an entity itself, and it needs care and it needs attention.
Mm-hmm. Great relationships aren't easy, right? You have to do some of the hard conversations to get it to grow to where you want it to be. So what advice would you have for maybe, I mean, it's hard because there's a lot of new people coming into tech. There's a lot of new people coming into the industry, especially right now. What advice would you give to some of these people who are maybe just walking in to product for the first time, or what should we tell them? Run? Yeah. I'm just kidding.
No, I mean, I think like if you're coming in right now, there's a good amount of chaos happening and upheaval in the industry. I mean, whether you're talking about layoffs, you're talking about like how AI is going to change whatever field, recognize that this field is changing and it's going to keep changing. That is not an option. And accept that is going to be part of your journey, is that it's going to be dealing with ongoing change and evolution. And that the more that you can make peace with that now, the easier it'll be to take things as they come, and then to decide how you want to respond and what it is that you want to do within that. I would say you can take in lots of information from lots of people who've been in the industry, but I would try not to over-index on the cynicism or the despair or the panicked calls that like the whole field is dying. I would really try not to over-index on that stuff. See that as people who are struggling or who are in pain and who are talking about some real things. There are real changes and there are real problems and there are real kind of inflection points. But to not let that define your experience and to really think about who you are outside of your work and to think about what you value and to know that you can find ways to express those things in jobs and outside of jobs. And it's important that you do. And that if you're not expressing some of that within your work, that's okay. Find a way to express it in your life and make peace with the fact that your job can mean something, but it's probably not going to be able to meet all those needs for you.
Amazing. Sarah, we are so appreciative of you being, I feel like I needed to hear all of these things for myself.
I think we all do. I think I still do.
Like I'm going to go back and listen to my own episode. Take reminders with me moving forward. So I know others are going to find a lot of value in this. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And we are so appreciative of the time that you took here with us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Molly. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe and leave a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you'd like to connect with us, check out our website at bouncepodcast.com.